Alexander is the greatest of all time. He's the GOAT. Yes, that's why the name is that. I'm just as ashamed as you are. Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs, where we should probably stop the intro there. If you want to be turning to Daniel chapter 8, that's where we're going to be today. We're doing class time. Class time is on Daniel. We're walking through the last chapters of Daniel. We're going into chapter 8 today, and there's a bit to think about here. I don't think chapter 8 is as complicated as chapter 7, for one simple reason. God actually sees fit to explain whatever just happened to Daniel. And he explains it in much greater detail, actually, which brings up the question, why is God so much more specific in chapter 8 than he is in chapter 7? If you remember chapter 7, one of the points of chapter 7, I think I made it in the recording, I definitely made it in class time here. I don't really remember what I recorded on. Again, these are just kind of my preliminary, I'm thinking through a bunch of ideas, here's some of that stuff, and then I format it better in the class, or hopefully better in the public class that's here, but hopefully you benefit from some of these ideas. I benefit from going through them, and I hope that you find some value in listening to this if you do. One of the main points of chapter 7 is that you do not have any identification of the individuals or creatures or kingdoms or whatever it is that those are supposed to be. In chapter 7, you have these 4 creatures that arise out of the water, one kind of like a lion, one kind of like a bear, one kind of like a leopard, oh my, and one kind of like just a beast. It's different. He's a whole different beast is the way we would express it in English. Man, I wonder if we got that expression from Daniel. We have the expression, the writings on the wall, that comes from Daniel chapter 5, probably, and so I wonder if a whole different beast to describe something where you can't really compare it to anything else, I wonder if that came from Daniel 7. I have no idea. I'm just throwing that out there. See, this is the place I can just throw that out there. In class, it's distracting, but here I can just do it, and it's fine. What you're dealing with in that chapter are these 4 things that arise, and so Daniel starts asking questions like, what in the world are these things? The answer in chapter 7, verse 17 is, these great beasts, which are 4 in number, are 4 kings who will arise from the earth, and the saints of the Most High will win. Okay, well, what's this 4th beast? He has 10 horns, and he has a little horn that destroys some of the others. Well, the 4th beast is a 4th kingdom in verse 23. 4th beast is a 4th kingdom on the earth. It's different from all the other kingdoms. It'll devour the whole earth and trample down and crush it. The 4 horns of this kingdom, 10 kings will arise. The little horn is a little king who is a supplanter of some other kings, etc., etc. But we don't actually know who they are. Now you can theorize, and I think the theory is pretty solid to say this is Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome is the monster beast. And you can theorize as to which 10 kings the Roman one is talking about, and it's probably something to do with Caesar and the house of Caesar, but like, good luck, right? Because you start counting that, and it starts getting complicated very quickly. Sometimes people are very clear on that, and they feel like they can pin historical dates and names and places and everything on that, and sometimes I look at that evidence and say, wow, that's pretty sketchy. Because that's not really the point of chapter 7. It's something you can do with chapter 7. It's a way that you can end up applying chapter 7, and it's an interesting study in itself to see what the specifics of chapter 7 could mean, but that's really not the point of chapter 7. If God wanted to be specific on what kingdoms he was talking about, he would be specific on what kingdoms he's talking about. And the reason I can say that so confidently is because when I look at chapter 8 and verse 20, I will see that God says, the ram which you see is Media and Persia. And the goat in verse 21 is Greece. And the horn on the goat is the king of Greece. I know what God's talking about. I know how to apply that historically because God literally told it to me. And that's the point of this chapter. This chapter is very specific on what's going to happen, and on the conflict between Medo-Persia and Greece, it's very specific that is the conflict it's talking about. You can't get around it and try to explain it away with something else. God just straight up says it. Because there's a time and place to not know what's coming in the future, to know just the generic picture of God's in control, whatever comes at you on the earth. And there's a time and place to know, hey, here is what is coming. God is in control, but here's what he foresees, and here are these things that are going to happen. Now, even as you're thinking about that, you might ask the question, why? Why is God specific with who is here in chapter 8 and not specific in chapter 7? And the answer is, I have no idea, because God didn't say, Daniel, I'm going to explain this one to you because I want you to know the identities of Medo-Persia and Greece in this instance, because of whatever reason. God doesn't say that here. And so I can't actually weigh in on what this is for. If I had to guess, I'm going to guess at something about the languages, because the languages are actually something significant to consider. When you look at the book of Daniel, there are multiple different ways that you could outline it. You could look at the first 6 chapters being the stories, and the second 6 chapters being the visions, which is vaguely true. Or you can look at it several different ways. Another way you could look at it is the languages that are used. Daniel is the only book in the Old Testament that is written in 2 different languages. All of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew except for Daniel 2 through 7. That's significant. Those are written in Aramaic. Hebrew is used in Daniel 1 and chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and the first part of 3, at which point it switches into Aramaic for the rest of chapter 2, essentially all of chapter 2, all the way through chapter 7, at which point, at the very end of chapter 7, it pops back into Hebrew for chapters 8 through 12. To me, why is it written in that way? I'm never told. Daniel didn't say why he wrote it in that way. But if I had to guess, it's because chapters 2 through 7 deal with issues specifically about the world in general. Hebrew as a language is a specific dialect for the Jewish people in chapters 1, chapters 8 through 12. Those are specifically for the Jewish people. Aramaic is the more generic stuff. It's a very similar language, I think, or at least it's related. I'm not a language expert on any of those things, but as far as I know, it's very similar. It's like a sister language, or Hebrew, it's a specific dialect of Aramaic. I started to say Armenian. It's not Armenian. It's Aramaic, right? Hebrew and Aramaic, very, very closely tied together, but they're not the same thing. That's pretty important to realize. Aramaic is the stuff that you would use to communicate with the people around you who weren't Hebrew. That's a significant use of that language in that region until Greek comes and replaces it, right, later on. But that's only going to happen after Greece comes in, and that's kind of what God's talking about, so we'll get to that a little bit later. Aramaic is written to be read not just by the Hebrews, but by everybody. Whereas Daniel 1 and then Daniel's 8 through 12 are reserved for the Hebrew people and the Jewish people, and they should be able to read those, and only them. Everything else in Daniel is more generic. It's fascinating that chapters 2 through 7 are also the chapters where Daniel deals with all these things going on in the world. Chapter 2, Daniel deals with Nebuchadnezzar. Now the Babylonians, who can't read Hebrew, they could read Aramaic, and so they could read the story about Daniel dealing with Nebuchadnezzar. They could read the story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Nebuchadnezzar. They could read the story about Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel again in chapter 4. They could read the story about Belshazzar and Daniel. They could read the story about Darius and Daniel. And they could even read chapter 7, which is to say, here are these various kingdoms of the world, and they are all impressive, but they all get replaced, and God's ultimately in control of all of them. Anyone in the ancient world is able to read that because that's written in the Aramaic, the generic language for the region. You come to chapter 1. Chapter 1 focuses on the issue of where is God? Where is the God of the Hebrews? Is he just in Jerusalem or is he somewhere else? Babylon doesn't care if God's just in Jerusalem. Only the Jews care if God's just in Jerusalem. Has God been destroyed? No. The Jews care about that. That one's written in Hebrew. And so is chapter 8. Starting in chapter 8, going through the end of the book, this is written in Hebrew. This stuff is specifically for the Jews. The people of the world need to know that kingdoms exist, but kingdoms always get replaced. Man's kingdoms always crumble and always get replaced by something else, and God is in control of all of it. Everyone needs to know that message. But only the Jews need to know how their specific history is going to be impacted by the people, by the kings that are coming after them, especially the kings of Greece, with some of the things those kings are going to do. That's why, in my opinion, I think that's why chapter 8 is written in Hebrew and Aramaic, Hebrew and not Aramaic. I think it's because it's specifically about the Hebrew people and exactly what they're going to go through, and so God starts to be very specific with them as they go right here. There's also the picture in the end of chapter 9. We'll talk about that in a couple weeks. There's a very specific picture, especially in chapter 11, of all this historical detail that's coming for them. That's also, we're going to talk about that in several weeks, like 4 weeks or something like that. Three or 4 weeks, we'll deal with chapter 11 and think about all of those things. The point is, right, point being, for all of that stuff, this is specific because Israel needs to know what's about to happen to them personally. They are about to, after Daniel dies, and really after the next couple of prophets dies, about 100 years after Daniel, God stops talking, and he stops talking for about 430 years. Who's in charge then? Right? How do you know who's in charge then? You know who's in charge because you can go back to Daniel and read about Greece destroying Medo-Persia. You can read about that all the way back in the 530s as Daniel's writing this. You can read that this would be 540 or something like that, 540 at the latest. That's way before Greece comes in 323 BC. But when 323 BC happens, the Jews can look back at history, can look back at Daniel and say, wow, that is Greece. We know where this history is going. When all these horrible things happen in the land of Israel in the 150s, 160s, later on with the Maccabean period, Israel can look back at Daniel and say, God was really specific about all of this. And we know these things are happening. God is setting up for the period of silence in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so I think that's why he starts getting specific as you get back into the Hebrew section, specifically of Daniel. So, all that being said, we haven't even started the introduction. One day, Daniel is sitting out at the river at the Ulai Canal. He's just kind of there. I don't know what he's doing there, if he's just hanging out or whatever the reason is. But he looks up, there are a bunch of loud noises. He looks around. Oh, there's a fight between two animals. That's kind of weird. What in the world is happening? It's a vision, much like there was in chapter 7, but it's been 2 or maybe 3 years since that vision. They're nearing the end of the Babylonian Empire. This is the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king. Again, going back to last time, it would be the 3rd year of Belshazzar's co-regency, because the very night that he claimed to be a king, that he initiated himself into the kingdom, was the night that Persia came in, supposedly in chapter 5. Probably that's how that went. He was co-regent for quite a while. I guess I probably didn't talk about this last week at all. He was co-regent with his father Nabonidus for quite a while. We don't actually know when the beginning of that was, so it's possible that this is like the week before the party in chapter 5 and then the absolute destruction of Babylon at the hands of Medo-Persia, or it's possible that it was another 10 years before the party in chapter 5 and the absolute destruction of Babylon at the hands of Medo-Persia. Point is, we're having the Babylonian Empire right now, but God's going to start talking about Medo-Persia, because they're the really relevant thing that's going to happen next. So, this is a weird sequel that zooms in on one idea from the previous chapter, from chapter 7, and it actually expands and kind of helps us interpret some of chapter 7, I think. So we'll read it, and then I'll talk about it in bits and pieces as I go through this kind of a sermon outline. This is a lot more detailed of an outline than last time, and I also haven't looked at this outline in a long time since I put this together, so good luck to me and good luck to you if you're listening to this. Hopefully this is not too terrible and you're able to get something valuable out of it. Daniel chapter 8, I'll start reading in verse 1 in a second. Excellent. Daniel 8, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. Then I raised my eyes and looked, And behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing on front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand against him, nor was there anyone to rescue him from his power, but he did as he pleased, and made himself great. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the entire earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a prominent horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. And I saw him come up beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and smashed his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat made himself exceedingly great, but once he became powerful, the large horn was broken, and in its place 4 prominent horns came up toward the 4 winds of heaven, and out of one of them came a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the heavenly lights, and some of the lights, that is, some of the stars, it threw down to the earth, and it trampled them. It even exalted itself to be equal with the commander of the army, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And because of an offense, the army will be given to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will hurl truth to the ground, and do as it pleases, and be successful. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one saying to that particular one who was speaking, "How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the offense causes horror, so as to allow both the sanctuary and the army to be trampled?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be properly restored." Verse 15. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, "Gabriel, explain the vision to this man." So he came near to where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. And he said to me, "Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end." Now while he was talking with me, I was dazed with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand at my place. And he said, "Behold, I am going to inform you of what will occur at the final period of the indignation, because it pertains to the appointed time of the end. The ram which you saw with the 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. The broken horn and the 4 horns that come up in its place represent 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. And in the latter period of their dominion, when the wrongdoers have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue, and his power will be mighty, but not by his own power, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and be successful and do as he pleases. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people. And through his shrewdness, he will make deceit a success by his influence. And he will make himself great in his own mind, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. And the vision of the evenings and the mornings which has been told is true, but as for you, keep the vision a secret, because it pertains to many days in the future." And then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was no one to explain it. Sometimes God plays the cards really close to his chest. Sometimes he just kind of says all of it and just tells you everything that's going to happen. This is one of those times. When you get into Daniel 8, what you see is a revelation of history, but it's so specific. It's funny in so many different ways. It's a funny picture. There's this funny interaction he has with this man who's definitely an angel. He's not a man, but, Daniel thinks he's a man or explains him as a man for whatever reason. We could talk about that. I probably will talk about that because I have enough time. If I remember it when I actually get to it in the outline. There's this whole, it's just funny. And so when you read it, I can't not laugh at it because there's so much in here that is entertaining to some extent. And it is important to actually have an understanding of the chapter, because as much as it is funny, it's really important to catch the details here. And then you can use those details to figure some things out in this chapter, but also figure some stuff out in chapter 7, I think, and that's kind of part of what we're going to explain. As you get through, you have these 3 major sections in chapter 8. This does not cover all of chapter 8, but this is a pretty good summary of most of the information that you're going to get. You deal with the ram in verses 3 and 4, and then he's interpreted in verse 20. You deal with the goat in verses 5 through 8, and he's interpreted in verses 21 and 22. You deal with the horn, the little horn, in verses 9 through 14, and then he's interpreted in verses 23 through 26. Now, as I'm looking at this, I'm realizing that I don't have any notes whatsoever on verses 15 through 19, which is the part where the angel actually comes in and talks to Daniel and helps interpret that. So let's just say an angel comes in and talks to Daniel and helps interpret that. And when we get there in the text, if I remember, I will have a couple things to say about it, because I do think that part's pretty funny, but I digress. It's not that important. When the ram comes in, I say it's not that important. It is important, the interaction, but I don't have it specifically noted here, so I hope that I remember to talk about it in a good and timely place, where it's appropriate to do so, etc., etc. When you have this ram that comes in, you have this vision of Daniel by the banks of the river, the canal, and God takes him out there. God shows him this vision of a ram and a goat who are just kind of going at it. The ram appears. Details on the ram. Fascinating stuff. He has 2 horns. One of them is longer than the other. He's heading in different directions, the directions being west, north, and south. He's not going east. Pay attention to that. Put that away. File that away in your mind somewhere. There is no competition with the ram. He is strong. No one can fight him off. You see a bunch of very impressive pictures about the ram, and the ram is ultimately going to be revealed to be Medo-Persia. Now that is very curious, because when you realize, verse 20, the 2 horns, the ram that you saw with the 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia, you start to ask some questions. He has 2 horns, right? That would be one for Media and one for Persia, presumably. Why is one longer than the other? A horn is a picture of power and strength or capability, so one that is short is obviously less capable or less powerful than the one that is long. Does that match up with Media and Persia, or what does that say about Media and Persia? Well, you know the kingdom of Persia, right? Everybody knows the kingdom of Persia. You know the kingdom of Media. Oh, you don't know the kingdom of Media? Oh, right. Because nobody cares about it. Nobody talks about it. Nobody ever considers the kingdom of Media by itself. It was a wimpy kingdom. It's, in many ways, Media and Persia are both kind of half kingdoms. They're less impressive. They're not very capable by themselves, but when they form this coalition of Medo-Persia, as it is called, so often in history, that becomes something formidable that's actually able to take out Babylon. Individually, Media could not do it, definitely couldn't, and Persia couldn't do it on its own, but together, Medo-Persia can do it. A coalition, although it is noteworthy that Media is much weaker than Persia. When we think about empires, we think about the Medo-Persian Empire, or we think about the Persian Empire. In many ways, those are the same thing, or those refer to 2 different time periods. Nobody thinks about the Median Empire because it just doesn't exist. One of those is more powerful than the other. One of those is more significant than the other. It's no surprise that one horn is there and the other horn is also there, much better, much more powerful. One is longer than the other. The longer one comes up last. I don't know why it comes up last, but I do think it's funny. We don't call it the Persia-Median Empire or the Perso-Median Empire. We call it the Medo-Persian Empire. That's curious to me because Persian is last. It comes up last, but it is the more significant one. Is that what God's talking about? I have no idea. I just think it's interesting, so I would throw that in there. The ram is representative of Medo-Persia. 2 parts that are mismatched is the description of the ram. With that description, you now need to go think about chapter 7, right? This is not ironclad at all, but one of the reasons I do believe in the Babylon, Medo, Persia, Greece, Rome interpretation from chapter 7, one of the reasons I believe that's the most correct, other than, you know, that's traditionally what people have usually said, and tradition is pretty correct in a lot of ways. Tradition ends up being right and ends up being pretty trustworthy. If there are traditional interpretations of passages, well, there may be passages that are traditionally misinterpreted and where I would go a different way, but on balance, tradition tends to be pretty good. There's a reason most people for most of time have thought in one particular way, etc., etc. So tradition could be part of it, why I think probably Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, Rome for the chapter 7 interpretation. However, another part of it is Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, Rome actually fits when you think about the details we have on Medo Persia from chapter 8. Medo Persia is the ram. We have that confirmed. The ram is significant because he has two horns, and one of them is shorter than the other. One of them is more powerful than the other. There is a mismatch in terms of power and capability between the two horns of the ram. If you go back and look at the bear would be the parallel. If Babylon is the lion with Nebuchadnezzar and etc., etc., then you have the bear as the second one. He would be Medo Persia. He would be the second part there. And the bear is significant. Daniel 7 in verse 5. Behold, another beast, a second one resembling a bear. It was raised up on one side. Huh. And in its mouth, 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said this to it, arise, devour much meat. So bear goes out to conquer, etc., etc. But he's described as being raised up on one side. There are two interpretations of that phrase that I've heard. One could be it's a hunchback, right? And so it's kind of shifted over. There's one side that's high and normal and one side that's kind of down and broken. So it's a deformed bear because one side is pulling way too much weight. That's a curious interpretation. The other interpretation is it is reared up to strike, and so you have one side that's raised up like it's about to come down and crush, whereas the other side is just kind of little and insignificant. A lot of bears will lift up 2 arms and then come down with their full weight, but here we have a bear who is mismatched and coming down to attack. Either way, basically the picture is one side of the bear is strong or active or capable or otherwise being used, and one side of the bear is a wimp. Curious, isn't it? If the bear is in fact Medo Persia, as I do think it is, that would line up pretty well with the ram having 2 horns, one of which is stronger than the other. Curious. And so I dock that thought right there. There is an imbalance of power in the bear. There is an imbalance of power in the ram. The ram is specifically called Medo Persia. And so I personally, I would look at chapter 8 and say, oh, that does inform how I read chapter 7. Interesting, isn't it? And so as not everybody needs to know that the bear is Medo Persia or needs to understand that if that is in fact the case of what's happening, because again, God does not explain that the bear is Medo Persia, right? That's just my supposition based on this ram idea, but he does explain the ram is Medo Persia, and I imagine people reading Daniel 8 can go back to Daniel 7. The Jews who have access to Daniel 8 can say, oh, I guess that probably is what that means. Interesting. And so we continue on. The basic point is the ram, whether or not the chapter 7 connection is there, you be the judge. I don't really care what you think about that. You can convince me it's not. Okay, and then we move on because it means the same thing anyway. Chapter 7 is about God ruling in the realm of mankind. Chapter 8 is about Medo Persia being the power, which inevitably means, by the way, if Medo Persia is the great power that nobody can resist, but Daniel is in the kingdom of Babylon, guess what's happening to Babylon? Unfortunate. Medo Persia is coming to eat their lunch, and then Medo Persia will be unmatchable. That's the point of chapter 8. And so we're back here. You'll have 2 different kings, 2 different strengths, 2 different levels of impact that they have. They are companions, but they are not equal. 2 horns, 1 creature, but one is stronger than the other. So you have that picture, and it does match with history because, like we've mentioned before, media is essentially not irrelevant, but unknown in history. We call it the Persian Empire because Persia's the primary power. And so, great for media to be a part of that, but media is not the significant player in the Medo-Persian Empire. Also of curious note, or not really curious note, it's just kind of, I guess it's just of note, in verse 4, Daniel 8, verse 4, when Daniel sees the ram butting westward and northward and southward, but not eastward, that's curious. Well, where did Medo-Persia go and expand to? They didn't go expand east. East is just India, right? They left that alone pretty much. And the brunt of their expansion was going up to Babylon, which was northwest, sorry, and then up through the rest of the known world to go all the way over into Greece, which would be north and west. They also spilled out down into the south, capturing the land of Israel and going into Egypt and having a little bit of influence there at least. And so they did go north, west, and south, but they didn't actually go east. Isn't it funny how God just nails that interpretation back in 540 BC or whenever this is, which is right before Persia even comes into power? I don't know if this is 6 months before they come into power or 20 years before they come into power. It's probably not that one, but there's some amount of time where God says, hey, this is what Persia is going to do, and then Persia goes and does it. However, it should be noted, Persia is not really the point of this vision. When you look at that, yes, this is God predicting something in the future. But it's God, predicting something 6 months in the future can be impressive, but it's not super impressive, right? And so if this is 3 or 6 months from the point at which Persia comes in to take over Babylon, an experienced advisor would be able to look at Persia and say, okay, Babylon's going to have some trouble with Persia here in the future. We may well lose the battle, right? And if they lose the battle, it's no surprise if Persia goes ahead and goes through the rest of the land of Babylon. That would make sense. It doesn't necessarily impress someone when you only predict a few months out or a couple years out, because that can be pretty predictable. But what if God can name drop the next nation who's going to come after Persia? Persia will take over from Babylon in about 539 BC. What if God can say, you know who's going to take over from Medo-Persia, or just Persia? It's going to be Greece. Greece doesn't come around until 323 BC with the advent of Alexander the Goat. Sorry, had to say it. With the advent of Alexander the Great, the first and primary king of Egypt, not Egypt, well, he was king of Egypt too, but that's not the point. King of Greece. That guy was incredible. God is calling that 220 years before it happens. That's something that's a lot more impressive. And that's what the prophecy ends up being about. God's statement of the ram existing is like, oh, Medo-Persia will exist and they'll be in charge. Okay, cool. A lot of people may be able to tell that at this point. I don't really know the geopolitical circumstance exactly at the time. Again, I don't know exactly what year this is happening in, so I'm not sure exactly how far out that was or how difficult the Medo-Persia call was to make, but the Greece pull is incredible, and God just kind of does it, because he does, back in the 530s or 40s. The goat comes in. The goat comes in, and it's ridiculous. The goat sprints into this fight. Verse 5, the male goat coming from the west over the surface of the entire earth without touching the ground. So, covering massive distance, not even touching the ground. He has a prominent horn, a big horn, only one, between his eyes. Absolutely trashes Medo-Persia, the ram. 2 horns, doesn't matter. Goat absolutely throws them down, tramples on them, gets super prideful, kind of like bigs itself up. That's such an old-timey phrase, but I like it. He makes himself so great, and he magnifies himself, and then suddenly the horn just kind of breaks, and there are 4 other horns, and out of one of those horns grows a little horn, it's very similar kind of idea to the stuff we saw in chapter 7. Although we're not talking about the 4th beast, the one who came after the kingdom after the bear. We're talking about the 3rd beast. So this is probably a different little horn than the one in chapter 7 if you're trying to interpret that. You can't read this back into the little horn from chapter 7, but the little horn in chapter 7 and the little horn in chapter 8 and the little horn in over in Revelation when you get over there, these are all little pictures that are communicating very similar ideas. Someone's going to come in power, a rat, a weasel, a snake, someone who's not good is going to come into power and take charge and then go after God's people. In both, from my interpretation, in both Greece and Rome, this is going to happen. And from here, it's clearly specified to be Greece, right? This chapter 8, this is about Greece, and Greece is going to mess some things up for you. What you see about the goat is also significant. He sprints in, he's incredibly fast, so fast he doesn't even touch the ground. Crazy. Does that sound like Greece? Yeah. When you think about Alexander the Great, how much of the earth did he conquer in, like, how many years, right? Comes into power, speed runs the entire ancient Near East, essentially. He conquers all of it, and then he dies at the age of, like, 32. In 323 BC, he is 32, right? That's how it goes. He dies when he's 32. So in, 12 years or whatever it is, he conquers the known world. Crazy. People back then were cracked. It's super efficient. Incredible show. There's a reason we call him the greatest of all time. Alexander, he was pretty great. He comes in super fast, sprinting across the whole earth to get to Persia. Absolutely trashes Persia. Persia is not a problem for him. Persia was held off back in the day, in the time of the 300, or, well, I know there were more than that, but, like, it's a better story when there are just 300 Spartans going up against the Persians, blocking that attack. Persia tries a couple of different times to attack Greece. Greece won't let them through. Greece beats them up and then pursues them, ends up pursuing them. They end up uniting together under a king, Philip of Macedon, king of Macedon, well, is where he was king of. That's Alexander the Great's father. He did some work in trying to unite Greece together, and I forget if he actually got Greece united and then died and handed a united Greece to Alexander, or I think Alexander came into power and then united Greece and took all of Greece over with him. I think that's how that works. I haven't read a book on that in a while, so I forget the exact details. What you have is this incredible war machine being gathered up to go sprint after Persia and just beat the living daylights out of these guys. When you think about chapter 7, if you go and read this back into chapter 7, you have, in chapter 7, you have the bear, which I think is a parallel to the ram, 2 horns, 2 sides, etc. You have the leopard in chapter 7, who's interesting. He's the 3rd kingdom, so he's the kingdom right after the bear. In chapter 7 and verse 6, I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. By the way, leopard's really fast, like the goat is really fast. Leopard has wings, so he flies like the goat doesn't touch the ground. The beast also had 4 heads. And what you see here is the goat that has 1 horn, but as soon as it magnifies itself, the horn breaks and splits into 4. Again, I do think you can read that back on that a little bit. You can look at chapter 7 and now say, okay, I think that fits with Greece. I think chapter 7 fits with Greece. I think the leopard in chapter 7 and the goat in chapter 8, they seem to be matched up pretty well. Either way, whether you think that's true or not, the goat in chapter 8 is definitely Greece because God says it is. This is Greece. By the way, I think this is God naming Greece before we even call it Greece. We kind of call it Greece because God named it Greece, because God is just forward-thinking like that. This is back in the days where it was Hellas. You have the northern part of Macedon, you have the southern part of Achaia, but as it comes together, it ends up putting together the kingdom of Greece, and it goes out as Greece. A strong leader from the west comes out and conquers everything. He conquers even the ram, Medo-Persia. He makes sure that nothing can stand against him, but as soon as he achieves power, then he dies. His power is broken and parceled out to 4 other kingdoms. Interesting, isn't it, that as soon as Alexander the Great achieved great power. Alexander the Great, first king of Greece, by the way. Chapter 8, verse 21. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. The large horn between his eyes is the first king. The broken horn and the four horns that come up in its place represent the four kingdoms that will arise from this nation, although not with his power. When Alexander the Great died, historically, his power split into four. He was young. He didn't have an heir at that time, not one that anyone would want to pay attention to, and so his generals came in and took over. His generals, one of them named Ptolemy, went away to Egypt and stayed there. One of them named Seleucus or something like that went and stayed in the land of Syria. That would be, Egypt is just to the south of Israel. Syria is just to the north of Israel. Keep that in mind for chapter 11, because we'll be dealing with kings of the north and south, and that corresponds really well to the Seleucids and the Ptolemies as they bicker back there. You also have Antigonus, who went and lived somewhere. You also have Cassander, who went and lived somewhere. One of those guys went back to Greece and helmed the empire from Macedonia and Achaia itself, and one of those guys, I believe, settled in Turkey, somewhere in that region. I think it was Cassander in Turkey, but could be wrong on that. I don't know much about those guys, because those two guys are irrelevant to the story of Israel, and chapter 8 is all about the story of Israel. Greece beats up Medo-Persia. Excellent. Alexander the Great comes in, is great, magnifies himself. He's a little too great. He dies. He just kind of dies out of nowhere, and he's replaced with his four generals. And out of one of those four, in the latter period, then this king comes up. And that's where we start to talk about the horn and all these bad things that the horn actually does. When the angel comes in to Daniel to explain these things to him, it's curious. He looks like a man. I think he looks like a man in comparison to God. In chapter 7, Daniel saw the Ancient of Days, who is clearly God. He's clearly not a human being, but in comparison, there's one like a son of man. He kind of looks like a human being in comparison to the Ancient of Days. Here, you have one who kind of looks like a man. It's obvious he's an angel, right? He's called Gabriel. He's the angel Gabriel, but Daniel just sees him kind of as a man in comparison to the greatness of God, or to the horrors of these beings that he's witnessing, to the ram and the goat and whatever else is happening. In comparison to those things, this guy who looks like a human being just looks like a human being. Gabriel comes up. There's this voice in the middle of the canal. I assume it's God who's talking, and the voice just says, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision," which is probably my favorite verse in the Bible out of context, because it's just funny to say like that. Make this man understand the vision. That's in New King James, I believe, and in English Standard Version. The only time, I will say, that those verses are translated better than the New American Standard does it in Daniel 8. I don't know that it's better from a strictly literal standpoint, but it's better because it's funny, and so I'll give them that. There you go. There's my praise for the other versions, and that's it. You will get no more from me. Gabriel comes in to explain some things to Daniel, and he actually explains things very, very nicely. He's how we know about Medo-Persia. He's how we know about Greece. He's how we know about this king that will arise and do all these things, is because Gabriel was appointed to actually spread the word to Daniel, to actually specify some of these little things. It is interesting when he starts to explain the vision. Daniel, as soon as the angel comes up to him, Daniel collapses on his face. This is standard angelic behavior, or rather standard human behavior in the presence of the angels. When you think about all of these different people in the Bible, they've encountered angels, and every single time the reaction to angels is collapsing on the ground in front of them and honoring them. In this case, it's like Daniel can't even stand back up in verse 18. What he's seen, he's an old guy at this point, so that probably doesn't help, but everything that he's seen is weighing on him. And so even as Gabriel's talking to him, Daniel in verse 18 is dazed with his face to the ground, and the angel has to pick him up, touch me, and make me stand at my place and say, "Hey, here's what's going on. Like, let me explain this to you. Let's make this as easy as it possibly can be." And he comes in with the information on the ram and then the goat. And then out of one of these descendants of the four horns will eventually come out, and he will end up ruling. He will be set in power. His power will be mighty, verse 24, but not by his own power. He'll inherit it from somebody else. He'll be given it by somebody. The leopard in Daniel 7, it says dominion was given to it. Here you have a picture of the descendant of the goat from chapter 8, but his power will not be his own. He'll just inherit it from his father, or maybe even just from God. God allows the dominion of evil people for a while. This little horn is going to use that. He goes up against the land. He goes up in these different places. He rises up in, where is it? It's back in verse 9. Out of one of them a rather small horn grew exceedingly great toward the south and the east. The south and the east of Greece would be Israel. Toward the south and the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up, it threw down some of the stars. It grew up, it exalted itself against the commander of the army. I assume that's the commander of the Lord's army. I'm not exactly sure, but it seems to be against God. He removed the regular sacrifice from him, from the commander of the Lord's army. Okay, he's going against God, and he's removing sacrifices. He's trying to fight. He's trying to destroy. He destroys the place of his sanctuary in verse 11. You see all these terrible things that are happening to it. He's taking control, and he seems like he's in charge. Verse 12, it hurls truth to the ground and does as it pleases, and it's successful in that. This is a king. This is not the monster beast. This is the descendant of the third. This is a descendant of the leopard. It's not the monster beast. This is not the little horn of the monster beast. The little horn of the monster beast will very much copy the playbook of the little horn from the goat, but they're not the same guy. And you'll see that play out in history. This is a king who is crafty, who is insolent, who does a lot to actually go in and destroy holiness. But when he goes in, he decides to take the fight to God himself. He exalts himself to the level of God, taking out stars in the sky and saying he's worthy of sacrifices and God isn't worthy of sacrifices. He takes the fight to God. He even, in many ways, he pretends that he is God until God comes in and says no and puts an end to him. When we get through history, when you get down to it, you go through Greece and you go through the Seleucid Empire primarily. The guys who settled in Syria, north of the Kingdom of Israel, but they had their eyes set on the south and the east and the beautiful land, and it goes down through Israel. There's a man named Antiochus the Fourth. He got in power. He's a crazy guy. He got in power, I think, by killing his brother or something like that. Didn't they all? Antiochus the Fourth, his nickname for himself, he put a little nickname, a little title on himself. He called himself the Epiphanes. Epiphany being, this transcendence of thought. An epiphany is when I didn't understand something, but I've had an epiphany. Now I understand everything about that. Epiphany is basically a way of saying that you are gods, or you are thinking like God. You are a god or a part of a god or something like that. It's a very divine title. It's a title for a god. He named himself a god. Antiochus Epiphanes went in and overthrew Jerusalem, which is probably what's referenced in the beautiful land. Antiochus is the one who banned the temple worship. He went in, he sacrificed a pig on the altar to defile it, to make sure people couldn't sacrifice to the Lord. Antiochus is just a bad guy. We're going to hear a lot about him in chapter 11. But the point is, with Antiochus, everything terrible that happens with Antiochus Epiphanes, he fights God, and then he ends up dying. And that's the end. Because nobody can fight God. And when you try, then you fail. It's going to happen, right? These terrible things are going to happen. How long will this happen? Verse 13, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the offense causes horror, so as to allow both the sanctuary and the army to be trampled? And this answer, these are, by the way, these are angels talking to each other, holy ones. These are like these great beings, God's messengers, one of them doesn't even know what's happening. And so he has to ask the other one for clarification. And the other one answers and says it's going to be a while. 2,300 evenings and mornings. I don't even know. I don't know. Is that representative of 2,300 years? No. Is that representative of a literal 2,300 days? Probably not. I think it's just 2,300, days in general. It's just, it's a while. It's a while. There's a lot of time that's going to pass for this. I don't remember exactly how many years that is. I guess I could look it up, but I don't want to do the math right now. This is a while. It's a while that it's allowed. But the reassurance is in verse 14. It happens for 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be properly restored. God knows that this little horn is going to arise and try to fight him. And God knows that God will win whatever fight comes his direction. And so he lets the little horn be for a while. But after a while, he'll come in and he'll take care of it. God has shown the capacity to do this. In chapter 4, God let Nebuchadnezzar be prideful for a while before he took it away. In chapter 5, God let Belshazzar be prideful for a while until he took it away. In chapter 7, God let the monster beast be actively mouthing off in his presence for a while, and then he took it away. In chapter 7, God let the lion be in charge and the bear be in charge. He gave dominion to the leopard for a while, but then chapter 7 and verse, Chapter 7 in verse 12, I think it is. The rest of the beasts, the dominion is taken away, but an extension of life is granted to them for a while, an appointed period of time. The point in all of these is not to specify when all of this is going to happen. God doesn't say Antiochus is going to be, it's about 150 years after Alexander is when Antiochus Epiphanes comes in, and he's going to mess up a whole lot of stuff. No. It's not about the time period. If God wanted to specify the time period, I'm pretty sure he could specify the time period. But it's not about what years it happens. It's not about how many years it happens. It's about the fact that God knows Medo-Persia is coming, and he knows Greece is coming, and he knows this little horn is going to be a real thorn in his side for a little while. But God also knows that he's going to fix it. And so you have Daniel chapter 8, which is just God going in and fixing the problem. Medo-Persia will come in. Babylon's not going to last forever, Daniel. Medo-Persia's coming. Greece is coming after that. Medo-Persia's not going to last forever, Daniel. I know. You won't live to see it. You're going to die pretty early in the Medo-Persian Empire period. You're old, okay? You're not going to see it. But God will remove them and replace them with Greece. And Greece isn't going to last forever. This little guy who's going to be such a nuisance, I'm going to take him out. Don't worry about it. And the vision of the evenings and the mornings, which has been told, is true. Verse 26. But as for you, keep that vision secret. It pertains to many days in the future. It's going to be another, let's see, if this is written in 540, this is when Daniel's seeing the vision, then it's going to be another 220 years until 323 when Alexander dies and is replaced. It's going to be another 170 years or whatever until about 160 BC when Antiochus Epiphanes is the ruler. It's going to be a while, nearly 400 years before all this happens. It pertains to many days from now, to many days in the future. So wait on it. Seal it up. Preserve it. Because when these things happen, God wants his people to be able to crack open the scroll of Daniel and read Daniel chapter 8. And, by the way, Daniel chapter 9 may well be about this. And, by the way, Daniel chapter 11 is definitely going to be about this. God wants his people to crack open the scroll and see that he knew about it the whole time. There has never been a moment where God is not in charge of the world. And there's never been a moment where God is not in charge of the kingdoms of man. The reason we spend time on this, God does not, this is not like, in 10 years you're going to have Antiochus Epiphanes again in the modern day. In 2029, Antiochus is going to show back up. It's nothing like that. The reason we spend time on this is because it's a reminder God provided for his people to make sure that they're not going to be surprised by history. History is rough. History always has been rough. You go through history right now, the people who are writing history books right now are going to have a field day with 2025 and 2026 when we get, 50 years in the future, 100 years in the future. How many people are going to look back over the last 8, 10, 12, 15 years period and say, wow, everything was just really simple and really easy and really nice back then, and nothing surprising ever happened, and everything was just normal? Of course they're not going to say that. But human history has always been up and down. Human history has always been calm and then not. Human history has always been peaceful and then it isn't. It's nice and then it's terrible, and it always goes back and forth. And one day, as you look back on history, I hope you can realize that God knew it all, and God's been there through it all. I know he hasn't specifically said, I know the history of America, etc., etc., but he knew it in Babylon, and he was there through Babylon, and he knew it in Medo-Persia, and he's there through Medo-Persia, and he knew it in Greece, and he was there through Greece, and he knew it in Rome, and he was there through Rome, and he knows it every time before and every time since. God's aware. History will not be easy, but God's in control, and it'll go okay. When the human kingdoms come and go, for Daniel, it was very abrupt, very swift, rather violent in many cases. Back in those days, regime change, a terrible, terrible thing. But God was still there. So it all worked out. And that is the most important thing. Do not fear the Antiochus who can kill your body, whoever that looks like. Fear God, who can kill both body and soul in hell. So, what do you do with that? Daniel hears this horrible message. Daniel is focusing on this. He's thinking about this. He gets some of it explained to him, not everything. Again, we don't know the identity of the little horn at this point, right? You can go into history and work it out, and it makes the most sense to be Antiochus, etc., etc. He's not told the specific name. He's not told Alexander the Great, and then Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, and then the other guy, Cassander. He's not told all of those names individually. He doesn't know all these answers, but he is told enough to get a sense of what's going to happen. And it says in verse 27, I, Daniel, was exhausted, and I was sick for days. The things that he has seen and the things that he's now thinking about, they've got him worried or stressed or in other ways just tired, just exhausted. He's run out. He doesn't know, what do you do when you hear that Babylon's going to die and Medo-Persia is going to die and all these terrible things are going to happen to your people eventually? What do you do when that happens? And the answer is pretty simple. I was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up and carried on the king's business. I was astounded at the vision, right? I was mind blown, flabbergasted. I didn't know what to do with it, stressed out about it, etc. There was no one to explain it. I couldn't get all the answers, and so these things were whirling around in my head. But some people, when the stress gets to them, or when it gets difficult, or when they are tired, or when whatever the excuse you want to give, some people, when that's the answer, just stress themselves out and get in their own head about it, and they just lose the ability to function. Daniel knows the answer. All these terrible things are happening. Get up and do the king's business. Daniel had a job to do, and it wasn't going to wait for him to get over it. It wasn't going to wait for him to figure out all the answers. It wasn't going to wait for him to have his life put back together. It wasn't going to wait for him to be in peace and simplicity. It wasn't going to wait for him to have all these nice and good and cozy things happen to him. Daniel had a job to do. And so he went out and did it, even though all these things are going on in the back of his mind. Too many people get hinged on this idea. There's so much bad in the world. There's so much trouble going on. There's so much that I just don't know the answer to, and they feel paralyzed and unable to do anything until they get all these ducks in a row and all these answers lined out or whatever it is. Quit doing that. You can be sick. Get up and do the king's business. You got work to do. You got a more important king than Belshazzar ever was, and he has business for you to attend to. Don't waste your time trying to figure out the unfigure-outable. It's not worth it. Just give yourself to God and do something useful and profitable with your time. That's where we end with Daniel. That's where it ends today. We will go ahead and pick up in next week. Class will be on Daniel 9, the first half of it. It's like the first 18 verses or something like that. It's the prayer that Daniel prays, and so we'll cover that. I'll release that next Wednesday. And there is no second sermon this week, so I will not post anything on Friday, but I will see you on Monday when I post whatever it is that I'm preaching on next week. See you then.